Today's episode of MaineWebNews is brought to you by Niffin's Specialty Meat. Stop and see them today at 388 on the Lakewood Road in Skowhegan.
And now, MaineWebNews.
Is bisphenol A a dangerous hormone disruptor that Maine should ban, or is the science still out in this matter? And should we delay taking action at this time? Those were some of the big questions that were asked today at a hearing in Augusta. Here are some of the highlights of this afternoon's meeting.
The blue tickets.
Good afternoon, Senator Saviello and members of the Environment and Natural Resources Committee. I am Jim Hamper from District 100, Mechanic Falls, Otisfield, and Oxford. And it's awfully nice to know ahead of time that I have nobody speaking against a bill that I'm introducing. I want to introduce you LD 412, a resolve regarding the legislative review of portions of Chapter 882, designation of biphenyl A as a priority chemical, and a regulation of biphenyl A in children's products, a major substantive rule of the Department of Environmental Protection. I have introduced the bill, and I would appreciate you deferring questions to those who will follow.
Senator Saviello, Representative Hamper, and members of this distinguished Environment and Natural Resources Committee, I am Darrell Brown, the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection, and I am speaking neither for nor against LD 412, which is the position of the Department. Our first choice is to always encourage market forces to undertake actions voluntarily and not jump to a prohibition on the sales of certain products. There are many other tools and options we can use as a regulatory agency, and we frankly don't wish to pursue sales prohibitions as mechanisms. We support scientific inquiries into the examination of safer alternatives regarding certain chemicals and compounds, and as is the case with BPA, we believe the marketplace is already moving towards safer alternatives. We believe the underlying framework law, which regulates chemicals of concern at a minimum, needs to be, first of all, further clarified in order to be made more certain for all involved. Secondly, we believe the list of potential chemicals, which is in excess of 1,700, needs to be narrowed and focused on those which are truly of high priority. And we believe that the overall process needs to be more focused on the products which are marketed to and used by children. These types of changes to the underlying framework law are needed to provide for a fair, balanced, and predictable regulatory program. Specific to the rule before you today, as you know, this bill provides for the legislative review regarding a provisionally adopted rule, Chapter 882, Section 5, which seeks to prohibit the sale of reusable food and beverage containers which contain the chemical bisphenol A, BPA. The rule, which was adopted by the Board of Environmental Protection on December 16, 2010, in essence has two components. The first component designates bisphenol A as a priority chemical and seeks information from certain manufacturers which sell certain products containing intentionally added bisphenol A to provide information to the DEP. These provisions of the rule, were designated as routine technical and became effective on January 9th. The second component, which is why we're here, seeks to prohibit the sale of reusable food and beverage containers which are marketed or intended for the use by children under 3 years of age. That portion of the rule is designated as major substantive and is before you for final review and approval under the Administrative Procedures Act. I would never attempt to ever speak for the Chief Executive. The Governor and I have had a conversation about this issue. The testimony that I have presented today has also been provided to the Governor's office with no adverse comments. Again, I want to stress that this is the position that the Department has taken.
Good afternoon, Senator Saviello, Representative Hamper, and the committee members. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify to support LD 412. My name is Jennifer Sass. I'm a senior scientist with the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, and I'm also a professorial lecturer at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I have a doctorate degree in molecular biology and postdoctorate in toxicology, environmental toxicology, and I've been working on chemical policy for 10 years. I'm also the mother of a grown son. He's now in college, but his physical, emotional, and intellectual development continue to be a daily priority for me. At this point in his life, I think about what effects hormone-disrupting chemicals like bisphenol A, or BPA, may have on his reproductive health and also the health of my future grandchildren through him. BPA was intentionally developed in the laboratory as an estrogen mimic chemical over 70 years ago, so there's no doubt that it is interfering with hormone or endocrine disrupting. Over 200 scientific studies on BPA have been published, which have demonstrated that exposures occur during fetal or early childhood development, and those can have lifelong impacts on reproduction, on early puberty, learning and behavior impairments, and a predisposition for developing cancers later in life, including prostate and breast cancer. This is a stack of some of the selected studies, several hundred of them in fact, that show positive effects from low levels of bisphenol A in laboratory tests. As well as human. There's some epidemiology studies as well. Low levels of bisphenol A, similar to those found in our bodies, have been demonstrated in these studies, published in the peer-reviewed literature by different independent academic labs to cause adverse effects on the development of animals' reproductive systems, brain, and behavior, and potentially the metabolic systems. And these are permanent dysfunctions. They're not repairable. Prenatal exposure has also been shown to increase susceptibility to prostate and mammary or breast cancer later in life.
I just want to make sure that Maine legislatures are better informed about BPA and other hormone disruptors and what they can do. I brought a picture today of my daughter. I believe you all have it there. It's a picture of a young woman, a mother, and a wife. All her beautiful curls lying at her feet from the effects of chemotherapy. Looking at this picture, I see eyes that will never look at life the same. BPA has been linked to many serious illnesses, including cancers, reproductive systems, disorders, learning disabilities. I ask you to please uphold the BPA phase-out rule and keep this hormone disruptor out of our products. There isn't anything any of you here today can do to turn back the clock for my daughter, but you do hold the power to create a healthier, safer future for my granddaughters and all Maine children. And I'll close with with something that I wrote to the governor. Mr. LePage, I so wish that my daughter's only concern was having a little beard. That, Mr. LePage, she could live with.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Urvashi Rangan. I'm Director of Technical Policy at Consumers Union. We publish Consumer Reports magazine. We have about 8.5 million subscribers. And I'm here today, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to come to you in support of this bill. Consumers Union was founded in 1936 as an expert, independent, nonprofit organization. We don't take commercial dollars. We have no vested interest in BPA. However, we do have an interest in protecting consumers, and we've done extensive testing on BPA both in plastics as well as canned foods over the last decade. And we warned consumers about the dangers of BPA even more than 10 years ago, and we continue today to encourage policymakers to really get this stuff out of food. We don't think people should have to continue eating it and ingesting it, given the huge mounting pile of evidence that Jennifer brought up here, and given that situation today. What we do know from the marketplace and from our testing is that the marketplace is moving toward alternatives on plastics, and that's a really good sign. It shows feasibility. But what we know is that the dollar stores are filled with plastics that contain BPA. We know that plastics are not required to be labeled, so it's very difficult for consumers to make informed purchasing decisions when it comes to the plastics they buy. They simply are not at liberty to always know what they're buying. And in that case, while the marketplace is showing feasibility, this law actually creates a safe haven where consumers don't have to do any guesswork in order to buy plastics that are free from BPA. I'd like to read you a quote from the most recent President's Cancer Report. This is from 2008-2009. And it found that the true burden of environmentally induced cancer has been grossly underestimated, with nearly 80,000 chemicals on the market in the U.S., many of which are used by millions of Americans in their daily lives, and they are understudied, largely unregulated. Exposure to potential environmental carcinogens is widespread. One such ubiquitous chemical, bisphenol A, is still found in many consumer products and remains unregulated in the United States, despite its growing link between BPA and several diseases, including various cancers. This is a very profound statement coming out from a very top-level committee suggesting that we need to take the call and we need to get bisphenol A out of the plastic products that we're using now. We probably need to go even further in the long term. But at the very least, legislation like this is incredibly important to creating a safer marketplace for all consumers, including our most vulnerable ones. The last thing I'd like to leave you with is we are concerned about this in particular because of the daily exposure to this chemical, because we know that levels circulating in the population are causing harm today. Levels in Americans seem to be twice that of Canadians. We don't know why. Levels in kids are higher than adults. That's a problem, and it's exactly why legislation like this is so important. Thank you.
We have that law, the Kids Safe Products Act. We went through that process, and BPA surfaced as the first priority chemical in this product category that's in the rule before you. The reusable food and beverage containers is the first area of product restriction. So I think that shows that the law is working. It shows the wisdom of having a deliberate science-based criteria and process for coming to these decisions. And as a result, I'm proud to say you are poised to have Maine become the 9th state to take this action rather than the first state. Many of our neighbors, Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, have already enacted very similar prohibitions in statute, as have some other states. Canada has taken an action formally. Several European countries, as well as the European Union, have targeted this product category. And quite recently, China has also targeted this product category for phase-out. So Maine is in the mainstream. We're not too far out ahead in tackling this chemical in this particular use of the chemical. And there's good justification for that. I handed out a summary of the science. The Maine Center for Disease Control and Prevention has thoroughly reviewed the science and has a statement that's part of your package. Although our federal agencies are handcuffed by a broken Toxic Substances Control Act, they do have good independent science, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services expressed formal concern about this chemical and the exposure of the babies in the womb and young children for certain health effects, brain, behavior, and prostate. U.S. Food and Drug Administration agrees with that expression of formal concern, as does the EPA. And also the leading scientific organization, independent scientists, the Endocrine Society, which is the scientists who study hormones. They have expressed formal scientific concern about this chemical and related endocrine disrupting chemicals. So we have a preponderance of science and policy and consensus, and I urge you to support the measure as is. Thank you.
Thanks. Any questions for Mike? Representative Iyer.
I promised Senator Saviello this would be my one question of the day. And I appreciate your dedication to these chemicals that harm children and people. Do you know of any one particular case or two particular cases or whatever where a doctor went into said to the patient, your cancer has been caused by BPA?
We are beginning to see the first evidence from human health studies related to BPA. Some of the scientists that have already testified can point you to those studies. Fortunately, we have very sophisticated animal tests that we can rely upon because, of course, it's unethical to deliberately expose a baby to a chemical and see what happens. We do eventually catch up with the human health evidence. When PCBs were banned by Congress in 1976, we had no evidence of chronic long-term human health effects. Now, 35 years later, that evidence has mounted. So they acted on the basis of animal evidence, and we have, as it was said, more than 200 peer-reviewed journal articles about the harm
So your
in
answer
animal
is
tests.
negative?
There are some human health studies that show adverse effects, a handful.
Any other questions? Thank you.
My name is Sandra Court. I'm a board member and I'm a past president of the Learning Disabilities Association of Maine. This testimony is in support of LD 412 as written and is submitted on behalf of the Learning Disabilities Association of Maine and 4 other learning and developmental disabilities organizations: the Autism Society of Maine, the Disabilities Rights Center, Gear Parent Network, and the Maine Developmental Disabilities Council. Our organizations work with individuals with learning, behavioral, and developmental disabilities and their families. And we are very aware of the challenges and costs families face raising these children with developmental disabilities. We also know there are significant costs to the schools, the communities, healthcare system, and the state to assure that these children and adults receive appropriate services. There are also costs associated with reduced workforce productivity over the lifetime for these children with developmental disabilities. For these reasons, our organizations strongly support the elimination of environmental factors that contribute to preventable disabling conditions, such as exposure to toxic chemicals in everyday consumer products. I've given you in my written testimony some statistics on the prevalence of developmental disabilities national, the prevalence of autism nationally and in the state of Maine. Maine has the second highest rate of autism in the nation. Many studies have linked BPA to neurodevelopmental effects, including learning disabilities. Low-dose bisphenol A exposure is implicated in changes in brain structure, brain chemistry, and behavior. And the fetus and children are particularly vulnerable as their brains and bodies are rapidly developing. Early exposure to BPA can be especially harmful and lead to lifelong neurological and learning challenges. Our organizations urge the committee to support LD 412. No child should have to face a lifelong struggle with a learning or developmental disability caused by toxins in the environment. This is why the Autism Society of Maine, the Disabilities Rights Center, the Gear Parent Network, the Learning Disabilities Association of Maine, and the Maine Developmental Disabilities Council support LD 412. Scientific research, public health recommendations, and our children demand this action. I've also submitted, because a representative of the Maine Parent Teacher Association could not be here, I've submitted their written testimony for you to look at. And I thank you for your time and your attention. And
Right on the money.
Questions?
Any questions? Representative Knapp.
Thank you very much for coming. Are you saying you're linking BPA with autism?
We are not sure, but we are concerned because BPA has been shown in research to impact the developing brain. And although we can't make a direct link, we should be taking precautionary measures. Anything that can impact that developing brain. We've taken action with lead. We know the old mercury has been obviously of concern with brain development. And now,
My name is Ben Gilman. I am from Gorham, and I represent the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, a statewide business organization made up of both large and small businesses, here to provide you with our testimony neither for nor against LD 412. The Maine State Chamber of Commerce does not oppose the designation of BPA as a priority chemical as put forward in the major substantive rule that is before the committee today, Section 5 of the major substantive rule. Our issue is with the overall process that brought BPA before this committee. 3 years ago, we stood before this committee and disagreed with the process when the legislation was presented and eventually passed. At the rulemaking before the Board of Environmental Protection, we raised our concerns again. And today, we do the same. We do not disagree there needs to be a process to deal with chemicals such as BPA. Our concern is with the current process in dealing with other chemicals on the list of 1,751 chemicals of high concern as they become identified by the DEP. We'd encourage the committee as we move forward and other legislation comes forward to address this current process. Thank you for the opportunity to provide our testimony today.
The Personal Care Products Council is the leading trade association in the United States for the industry. We represent manufacturers and distributors of personal care products as well as suppliers of ingredients, raw materials, packaging, and other services that help us bring our finished products to market. And our concern here today is less about BPA and the accompanying rule and more about what's next. There are 1,750 chemicals, as you know, on the so-called list of chemicals of high concern, and it's possible, if not probable, that one of those chemicals could impact our industry and the products that we market, such as moisturizers, sunscreens, and toothpaste and other products essential for today's consumer lifestyles a great deal. Now, next week, you're going to hear a lot about the underlying statute that governs this rule that's before you, and we're encouraged by the fact that there seems to be some bipartisan support for a narrowing of that underlying statute. It's a complicated law, potentially very costly for the business community to comply with, and we simply ask you to deliberate thoroughly. We know you will, and that's it. Thank you for your time, and we will see you next week.
Questions?
Should Maine ban BPA? As always, we want to know what you think, so please leave us a comment that will instantly become part of our story. This is Jared LeBlanc with Maine Web News.